Hello and welcome once again to another episode in Interesting Stories in the History of Diagnostics. This is Mickey Urdea for Halteris Associates. Today I'm going to talk a bit about the history of syphilis, which ends up being rather interesting. In 1495, Charles VIII of France took an army of 50,000 men and attacked the city of Naples in one of the first, what was called, Italian Wars. He managed to very quickly defeat the local army and marched into the city. And after they took the city, there was an enormous celebration that occurred with the locals and the soldiers. Now, I want you to remember this date of 1495, because I'm going to come back to this, and it's had historical significance that I'll explain. They had a very big celebration, lots of debauchery, and they marched back out of the city and moved back towards France. Along the way, many of the soldiers became very ill. They had what were genital lesions. They developed, within the next week or so, fever. They had terrible pains, enormous fatigue, and along that march and the return to France, many of the soldiers were incapacitated, unable to walk, let alone fight. When they got back to France, the army disbanded. It was composed of many mercenaries from all over Europe. There were Flemish, there were people from Italy, interestingly, despite the fact they marched on Italy, and they returned to their homes. And they took with them this disease. In 5 years after that return, this new disease, which didn't quite have a name yet, the disease broke out in Britain, Poland, in Russia, in Greece, and in Hungary. Within 25 years, it had spread to Africa, Asia, and even islands in the Pacific. So blame was spread around for the origins of this disease. The French called it the Neapolitan disease, or the disease from Naples. The people in Italy called it morbus gallicus, which means basically the French disease. The Russians called it the Polish disease. The Polish called it the Turkish disease. And the Turkish people called it the Christian disease, which is rather interesting. It had additional names such as the Persian fire, and my favorite was Grand Gore, which was what the Scots called it. There were many contemporary reports of this disease, and even wood blocks indicating the symptoms and how aggressive it was, and even lethal. It was very clear that this was a much more aggressive disease than what we call syphilis today. But over time, over the next 50 to 100 years, it began to become less lethal and less aggressive. And this makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary point of view. It's very common, right, that we have a new disease like we're dealing with now with COVID-19 that initially is quite aggressive and later becomes less so. And this is particularly in a situation where it's a new disease and a new population has absolutely no history of it and therefore no immune response. Locals had made the association between sexual activity and syphilis. And it's very interesting that they had a local theory about other contagious diseases as well, that there were some sorts of particles associated with the disease that are being moved from one person to another. It's interesting that at this point, talking about particles moving from one person to another, they were darn close to germ theory, but they never quite got there. They had to wait for a few more centuries to pin that down. And in fact, that happened a number of times throughout history, that people at various times started thinking about transmittable things, whatever they might be, but not knowing quite what they were. But just as evidence of the fact that people knew about sexual activity and syphilis, the King of England, Henry VIII, actually decided to close down the brothels in London because he wanted to eliminate the transmission of syphilis. By the 18th century, the disease had become very different and much closer to what we're accustomed to today. So at that point, there were recognized 4 stages of the disease. The first one being now genital warts, really what is referred to as a chancre, as the first stage. Usually it's painless. And within the next 2 to 8 weeks, it transforms into what is referred to as secondary syphilis, which involves fever and rash, and sometimes can be relatively severe in some individuals, but often not. And then a latent phase, and that can last for as little as a month, but could also be many years. And sometimes during that so-called latent phase, the second stage can return. But what is often the case is it leads to what is called tertiary syphilis. And this, of course, is the one that we are familiar with having occurred in a lot of famous people. It's usually neurological, but could also be cardiovascular. It can result in what are referred to as gumata, which are lesions both inside and outside the body. A lot of famous people had syphilis and then tertiary syphilis. In particular, it's well known in musical composers. Mozart, Paganini, Beethoven all had syphilis. The composers Schumann and Schubert and Smetana and Scott Joplin all died of tertiary syphilis. In addition to the musical composers, there were other people that, of course, had and in some cases died from syphilis. For example, Al Capone, the painter Paul Gauguin, and Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. So this was very prevalent in the population for centuries. Finally, in the late 1800s, Paul Ehrlich, who we've talked about before, found a drug which was originally called 606, later Selvarsen, that was finally effective against syphilis and effectively killed the causative organism Treponema pallidum. He won the Nobel Prize for that in 1908. And since then, a lot of additional and better drugs were developed. Now I want to go all the way back to what I initially talked about, which was this issue of 1495. This was a mere 2 years after Christopher Columbus and his first crew came back from the New World. And this 1495 outbreak was the first such historical description of a disease like this, although there's some controversy about that I'll come back to in a few moments. But for more than 500 years now, people have speculated on the possibility that this was actually a disease that initiated in the New World and came back to the Old World. But there's been a lot of controversy about this because many people believe that it was already in the Old World and just happened to be a major flare at this point in 1495. Been a lot of good reports about this, but a particularly good one is from a Kristen Harper et al., published in 2011. And this team actually went through the history of this, looked at many documents, and made some conclusions based on a lot of other people's work as well. There's a connection to Spain here, in that both in the Italian army in Naples in 1495 and in the French army, which I mentioned before, there were Spanish mercenaries. So they linked back to Italy. There were contemporary reports in Spain of the fact that Columbus's crew came back with a new disease, and that it had symptoms that sounded an awful lot like what was described in 1495. In fact, a Barcelona physician wrote a report of the fact that he had treated some of the crew, and he had also observed the spread of this disease locally in Barcelona. So this is very interesting, and in fact, Columbus's crew had reported the fact that they saw a very bad disease on the island Hispaniola, in what is currently Santo Domingo, where they had landed, and that this had been prevalent in that area for a very long time, the locals told them. So, very interesting here. On the other hand, if you look at other reports, many people said, well, you know, it probably is not from the New World. In fact, we see reports going all the way back to the Romans and even before that of diseases that they called things like leprosy, that we don't believe were leprosy. We believe that was actually syphilis. So that's where the problem is. At the end of this report from Harper et al., they concluded, and this is based on 54 reports that they had reviewed from many different sources, they concluded that it was most likely that this was a disease of the New World that was brought to the Old World at the time of Columbus's so-called Columbian Exchange. Now, it was known that there were diseases of the Old World that were based on the same genus of bacterium, Treponema, but not Treponema pallidum per se, but others. For instance, the disease yaws from Africa, and another disease called Begel. We knew that, but there was no direct evidence of there being syphilis per se. In 2020, a report came out from the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Human History. A researcher there named Johannes Kraus spearheaded the study. What they did was they managed to find a set of 9 skeletons from a number of locations: Finland, Estonia, and the Netherlands. And these skeletons were contemporary with this period in the late 1400s, before and after the Columbian Exchange. And they were able to actually grind bones from these skeletons in order to create a powder that they then extracted and sequenced. Now, that may sound odd, but the reason for that is that the organism usually doesn't last very long. And often in late-stage syphilis, you get infection of the bone, and they were hoping that they might actually be able to find DNA that was preserved. And they even said at the time, 5 years before that, nobody would believe we could even do this experiment. So they did it, they sequenced it, and they found evidence of treponemal DNA in 7 of these skeletons. Now, what they found is that they believed they had DNA from the species that causes yaws, and they found a species that had not been reported before, that doesn't seem to have any contemporary counterpart. So something that was in the human population then, but not now. And they also claimed that they found DNA from Treponema pallidum, which suggests that's syphilis. Well, there's been a lot of pushback on that study because that would suggest that it was in the Old World population already. And the problem is that the confidence intervals about the time of the burial of those people is not very good. And in fact, Johannes himself has said that, yes, we recognize that this is not the nail in the coffin. And what we need to do is to find more skeletons in both the Old World and the New World and see if we can't really understand what the origins were. And of course, that would be incredible. Unfortunately, of course, if they don't find the DNA in old skeletons in the Old World, that's not proof. It's, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So they'll continue to look. But if they find it in the New World, before the Columbian Exchange, that would be very informative. So at this point, it remains a controversy, goes back and forth quite often, but I'm betting on the fact that this is probably an example of the fact that the Columbian Exchange of pathogens went both ways. So thank you once again for joining us in another of our episodes in Interesting Stories in the History of Diagnostics. This is Mickey Urdea for Halteris Associates. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.